So I guess I'd like to begin, if I may. It's a real distinct pleasure to present today's college distinguished lecture by James Plummer, currently Dean of Engineering and Professor of Electrical Engineering at Stanford. Dr. Plummer's talk today, Educating Engineers for the 21st Century, deals with a crisis that we are facing in Europe, Japan, and the US, which is declining interest in engineering. And contrast India and China, where the numbers are increasing dramatically. So the question that logically arises is why? What are we doing wrong? What are we overlooking? It's been suggested that perhaps in the US we pack too much technical material into our undergraduate engineering curriculums. Maybe we ought to expand topics to include entrepreneurship, creativity, innovation. So we're going to hear Dean Plummer's view on some of these ideas. Now, he doesn't merely discuss the change in engineering. He actually puts theory into practice. We know that Stanford has long enjoyed a reputation for its math, science, and engineering programs. But now, Dean Plummer is boldly expanding the university's appeal to a broader range of students. And he wants to get the word out. That is, students don't need to be complete techies to be interested in engineering at Stanford. And I quote, "We're looking for kids who think of the world in terms of finding solutions to big problems, like global warming, international development, and the environment," he explained during a 2010 interview. "We want to attract students who might have a wider world view. Students who arrive at Stanford with a concern about climate change need to understand that engineers are working on that right now," end of quote. You're still going to have high-tech companies like Google, Hewlett-Packard, eBay, all started by engineering students from Stanford who are going to require the techies that we graduate. But we're also going to find other companies that want graduates who perform well over time. Will they become project leaders in 5, 10, 15 years? And I quote Dr. Plummer, "Such students might not be as technically facile during the same interview, but they may have new ideas that take a very different view of problems." As a result of this interest, Dr. Plummer has pushed to broaden Stanford's engineering student by experience, including classes in entrepreneurship, negotiation, and other disciplines. And the philosophy has led to an appreciation of other campus innovations. For example, Stanford's Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design, completed in 2010, better known as the D School, was conceived and built so that every space within could help capture a fleeting idea. So walls can be reconfigured, there's whiteboards everywhere, and these invite input. Students circulate throughout the building and they can see what others are doing and perhaps contribute to somebody else's idea. Dr. Plummer couldn't have been more pleased when this facility opened, and I quote him, "The competitive advantage that a place like Silicon Valley has," he said, "is creating the next thing. The D School is a place where we can try to create graduates who will be innovators." Jim Plummer was born in Toronto, Canada, and came to the US and obtained his undergraduate degree at UCLA and earned a master's degree in '67 and a doctorate in '71 in ECE, both at Stanford. He immediately became a research staff at Stanford's Integrated Circuits Lab and later joined the faculty in 1978. He became a professor of ECE in '83, eventually rising through a number of leadership roles, including chairs of Stanford's ECE department, director of the IC lab, and senior associate dean of the School of Engineering, and he became dean in 1999. He's worked in a variety of areas in a broad field of silicon devices and technology, starting with his early research into high voltage integrated circuits and device structures. This work led to several power metal oxide semiconductor device concepts, such as the insulated gate bipolar transistor, which have become very important devices today. Subsequent work with support from colleagues such as Stanford's Robert Dutton led to the development of several generations of Supreme, which has become the standard process modeling tool used worldwide to this date. Dr. Plummer's more recent efforts have focused on nanoscale silicon devices for logic and memory. He's got many honors, and these include the 2001 Semiconductor Research Corporation's University Research Award for career contributions that advance the semiconductor industry. He's won numerous awards from the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineering, including the Third Millennium Medal in 2000, the Albert van der Ziel Award and the J.J. Ibbers Award both in '03 and the Andrew S. Grove Award in '07. In '08, he was elected into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's also a member of the National Academy of Engineering and an IEEE Fellow. He's graduated over 80 PhDs with whom he's published over 400 papers and conference presentations. And his recent textbook, Silicon VLSI Technology, Fundamentals, Practice, and Modeling, is used by many universities around the world. In his role as dean, Dr. Plummer helped rally companies such as Exxon, Mobil, GE, and others to create a 10-year, $225 million program for research into alternative energy. His outside board memberships include director positions with Leaders Technology, Inc., Intel, Cadence Designs, Inc., and just a few months ago, he was appointed to the President's Council of the Olin College of Engineering. If you remember, the president of Olin College is one of our own alumni, Rick Miller. We're very proud of that enterprise. All of those responsibilities aside, one of his current challenges involves discussing the degree to which Stanford is willing to embrace cutting-edge concepts of online learning. In fact, a few professors made headlines by offering online courses at no cost and drew more than 100,000 students, many of whom quite reasonably expect to receive credit. For the moment, Stanford's official position stops short of awarding online student certificates that bear the university's name, but the debate continues. I quote, "Stanford always has been a place where we will try bold new things," Dr. Plummer admitted when interviewed earlier this year on National Public Radio, even if we don't know what the consequences will be. It's a real pleasure to have Dean Plummer here at UC Davis. Please join me in a warm applause.
So thank you so much. It's a great privilege to be here with you this morning and to share with you some thoughts about engineering education. Usually when I give talks, or often when I give them, they're more technical, and today I wanted to kind of talk about engineering education from a number of different perspectives, because I think as we all know, there are real challenges with trying to find enough young people, especially young people born in the United States, who will consider careers in science, engineering, and mathematics. And to be honest, I think part of the issue that we face today is of our own making because of the way in which we've structured engineering undergraduate curricula. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we might think about going forward, I think, a better job in terms of educating young people who are going to be the innovators and the people who will create the new companies and industries of the future. So I will leave some time at the end for some questions, but I would like to begin by asking the question, what should the role of engineering schools be in educating 21st century engineers? And there's some of these things are obvious. I mean, obviously we need to start with the foundation of providing a solid, great technical education for our undergraduate students. I mean, if they can't be an engineer, then we shouldn't give them a degree in engineering. And so they really need to be able to practice as engineers. And so that's kind of the foundation. But I think we need to go well beyond that. I think we need to try and learn how to teach students how to be entrepreneurial, how to be creative, how to be innovative. And this term, think out of the box, is probably overused, but I think it actually describes one of the attributes we would want our students, whether they're from UC Davis or from Stanford or from any other university, to have when they leave our engineering schools. We also, of course, in research universities like UC Davis and Stanford, we have lots of research programs going on, and we need to think about how we should focus those programs to create technologies and ideas that can reinvent existing companies and that can spawn new companies. And I'm sure you've all seen the statistics that the vast majority of new jobs that are created in this country are created in small companies and startup companies. And so the method to grow the economy is often to create new companies, and very often those are spun out of universities because of ideas that come with the students who are graduating. Now I'm going to talk a bit about undergraduate curricula, and one of the things that I'm going to try and show or convince you of, if you may not agree with this, but I'll at least try and convince you of it, that we cannot teach undergraduate engineers everything they're going to need throughout their career. We just can't do it. I mean, engineering is a series of dynamic disciplines which are changing all the time, and no matter what we might teach them in the 4 years we have them, it's going to be outdated. You know, the half-life of engineering knowledge is regarded to be 5 years or something like that. So in some respects, it doesn't really matter what we teach them, you know, because it's going to be out of date in 5 years anyway. And so we need to think about ongoing professional education throughout the careers of practicing engineers. And this will bring me to the topic of online education, which has had some interesting developments recently, and I think it's going to have fairly profound implications for how we think about educating not just engineers, but for college students in general. So if you take those as sort of the things that we ought to do, I think it's probably fair to say that engineering schools historically have focused mainly on the technical education part. So they focus mainly on this part up here of how to provide an education for undergraduates. And I'm going to show one example of some things we can do in this area to make the technical education, I think, better. But I'm going to spend most of my time focusing on these areas because I think they're the ones that historically engineering schools have not done a good job at and really need to do a good job at going forward if we're going to provide the kinds of graduates who are going to be the innovators and the creators of new companies and industries and so on as they work through their careers. So here's an outline of the talk. I want to talk first about reinventing engineering education, and this is sort of about the technical part of the education. So what can we do with the technical education we're trying to provide for engineering undergraduates that's going to get more young people interested? And I like to say we need the best and the brightest young people in this country going into careers in engineering or science or mathematics. And how do we create a curriculum that will both educate them and get them interested in those kinds of career opportunities? Then I'm going to talk about going beyond technical skills, some of these other things about creativity, innovation, and so on, and then a bit about research, and then finally about online education. So let me start with the first two of these, and I'm going to wrap them together in some sense. So the idea here is both how do we provide a solid technical education, but how do we go beyond that for our undergraduate students? So I like this picture, although it's taken from the 1950s, which was long before any of the students here were born. But and it's a little bit probably extreme in the picture. But some people, when they think about an engineering education, think about sitting in a classroom like this, and there's typically a faculty member, and of course in the 1950s it would have been exclusively a male faculty member, and he would have been standing up at the blackboard, writing on the blackboard, probably deriving some equations, and the students are furiously writing down everything that he writes, and there's very little interchange between the faculty member and the students. And that was an engineering education, and that's a bit of an extreme view, but if you think about how we teach or have taught historically engineering, it's all obviously science-based, lots of math, physics, and chemistry, and the methodology has been to tell students, look, if you want to be an engineer, then why don't you go take a bunch of math and physics and chemistry and then increasingly today even biology and learn this science stuff. You know, if you get through all of that, then you can come back to the engineering school and we'll tell you why you need to learn it. You know, the exciting things you can actually do with an engineering degree. Engineering has also been focused historically on producing students who will be immediately productive. So when a student graduates with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering or mechanical engineering, the expectation from industry has always been that those students can walk in the door, sit down in their cubicle, and on day one be immediately productive in terms of helping that company develop its products. Now, if you think about other professions, that's actually not the way they work. If you think about law or medicine or business, the way those professions work is that generally the students are encouraged to take a much broader liberal arts undergraduate education, and then in their graduate work they learn the detailed skills they need to become a lawyer, to become a doctor, to get an MBA, and to become a leader in business. So engineering is kind of unique in that we've always focused on producing bachelor's graduates who can walk into a company on day one and do the job with essentially very little additional training. So that's the way it's been. Now, what's changed? Well, if you think about the last decade especially, but even earlier than that, I mean, obviously the internet has had a huge impact. I mean, when When I watch my daughters, or I'm sure all of you who are students here, if they want to learn something, they do a Google search, and they find they can get information anywhere in the world, at any time, any place. They don't go to a library to find out things anymore. They Google it. If you think about careers today, they're increasingly global. Companies are global. People who are going to work in large companies are probably going to live in a variety of places in the world throughout their careers. Lifelong learning is essential because we can't teach students everything they're going to need through their careers, so they've got to recognize they're going to be lifelong learners, and we need to think about how to make that happen. And of course, technology is changing so rapidly that the biggest winning thing in companies is innovation. It's not sort of the fundamental skills which are necessary, obviously, but if you have employees in your company who are innovators, who are people who create new ideas and have the out-of-the-box product ideas, those are the companies and those are the organizations that will win. So I want to show you a short video. Sarah is actually she's graduated now, but she was an undergraduate engineering major at Stanford. And listen to what she says about her classes and what she learned as an engineering undergraduate major.
So I think that now information is only relayed through websites and technology and email because, I mean, I guess it's kind of sad, but you can't, I feel like professors can't really expect people to always be in class now, these days because so much of the class material is available online. So I'd say that out of my courses at Stanford, at least in the last 2 years, at least half of them have been taped. So you don't actually even have to show up. Homework is always distributed through email or coursework websites. Correspondence happens through that as well. I think, again, it comes down to efficiency. I don't usually attend all my lectures, but I think that it's great to be able to go back and reiterate over what people have said. And sometimes, you're taking notes in class and you just can't take them fast enough. And I think that the video feature, at least, is a really great one to be able to kind of go back and say, what exactly did he say in that sentence? And I think that's a great feature. And it also allows people outside of Stanford to access resources that they may not have.
So she said some interesting things there, but the two things I want to emphasize is she said, first of all, you don't really need to go to class, I mean, all this stuff's online. If you want to learn something, you can get it over the internet, and the homework is distributed over the internet and so on. And so, basically, people like me who stand up there and lecture, I mean, you don't need to do that anymore, right? So why do that? Then she said, but having some of this online stuff is actually very valuable because I can repeat things, I can go back and I can rerun them, I can study, I can use it, I can take 2 classes at once if I want to, I can do lots of things that I couldn't do when I was constrained just to go to a physical classroom with someone standing up and writing on the blackboard. So I'm going to come back to some of these points through this talk. So let's start by asking what are the critical skills that our students need to learn as undergraduates in an engineering program. And obviously, the foundation is technical depth, and we can't back away from the fact that we need to provide a technical education for our students. But we need to do a lot more than that. We need to provide some skills, I think, in many of these other areas. Teach our students how to be creative and innovative, give them an entrepreneurial outlook, and so on. And these things, in many respects, are a lot harder to teach than the technical skills. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but it's not the case that you could sign up for a class on creativity and expect to walk into a classroom and have the faculty member put the 10 bullets to becoming a creative person on the blackboard. That's not how it works. And so the question is, how do we teach young people how to be creative? Or can we even teach it? Maybe we can't. Maybe some people have the right genes and some don't, and some are going to be innovative and some aren't. I actually don't believe that, but we need, if we're going to say we really need to provide these kinds of skills, then how do we do it as part of an undergraduate education? Now, one way that I think about this is this concept of T-shaped people, and a number of people have used this analogy. I'm not sure who the first one was that did it, but the idea here basically is that the vertical part of the T represents the technical education that we need to provide for our students. So that's your major in EE or ME or whatever particular major you're in. The horizontal part of it up here are these other skills, and they're sometimes called the softer skills, but I think they're actually just as important as the skills that we try and teach our students in the deep technical majors. Now, part of the issue in engineering, of course, is that even this part of it is a set of skills or a set of ideas and abilities which change rapidly with time, because engineering majors rapidly evolve with time. And so we can't just take for granted that we can do a decent job down here. We really need to think about how we teach the technical content as well and have it evolve over time. So I want to give you one example from the vertical part of the T and how one could think about technical education perhaps in a slightly different way. And the example I'm going to give you is the computer science curriculum that we recently redid at Stanford 4 or 5 years ago. So if you go back a decade, beginning with the dot-com crash around 2000 and so on, CS departments nationwide saw a very large decline in majors. I mean, we saw a drop by a factor of 2. I mean, students just, you know, when the late 1900s, people thought, you know, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a bachelor's degree in computer science, then I'm going to write a business plan, I'm going to go up to Sand Hill Road, I'm going to get $10 million in VC funding, and then I'm going to do my IPO, and then I'm going to retire, all by the time I'm 25. And there actually were a few examples of people who did that, and that was partly responsible for the huge rise in computer science majors in the late 90s and early 00s. But then it crashed, and the dot-com crash happened. And then there became this perception that, you know, I actually really don't want to major in computer science because a computer science job basically is equivalent to sitting in a cubicle and writing code. And I mean, who wants to do that? I mean, there are better ways to spend your life than sitting in a little cubicle somewhere and writing C code or Java code or script or something. There was also a perception that, you know, another reason not to major in CS is because all software jobs are going to India. And so why would you learn how to write code? Because there are going to be no jobs if you do, unless you want to move to India and work for a much lower wage in that country. So actually, neither of these is correct. There actually are all kinds of jobs for software engineers. There are more jobs than there are graduates even today. But part of the issue, I think, was one of our own creation, because the way computer science undergraduate programs were set up at that time largely was like most engineering majors. Okay, so you want to be a computer scientist, all right, take the math and all that stuff first. Then we're going to teach you how to program, you know, teach you all the skills about programming. And don't worry about why. You know, we're going to learn how to write code and how to see that it's correct and everything else. And then when you've done all that, then we'll talk about some interesting applications. You know, maybe when you're a senior, you can work on an autonomous driving vehicle, you know, and sort of learn that the software in there is what makes that vehicle think and be able to navigate and so on. But you know, we'll do that later. So part of it was the structure of the undergraduate curriculum. So if you look at, you could actually draw a picture like this for any engineering major, but for computer science, there's a core set of things that are regarded as sort of the foundations of the field, systems, AI, and theory in the case of computer science. And the problem with this is that the foundations of any field only grow with time. You know, as the fields become bigger and there are more things you need to know to be a competent computer scientist, then the skill sets or the things you need to learn, this only gets bigger with time, with the result that the really interesting stuff that's out here, all the application areas, barely get touched on in undergraduate curricula. So the foundation topics only increase in scope. So the easy thing for us to do as educators is simply to expand the size of this yellow bubble, which means there's even less time for our students to sort of get immersed in some of these application areas. And so this is one of the things I think that drives students away from engineering majors. You know, we just keep expanding the domain of the things you've got to know, foundational things, and not ever getting time to get to the really interesting, exciting things that engineers can actually do with their careers. So the main thing this accomplishes, I think, is to, in most engineering curricula, is actually just to lose more students to other majors, because they just don't put up with having to learn all this stuff first without really getting a chance to see why they're learning it or what the great opportunities are for an engineering career. So we and others have tried to work on this problem, and one way to think about a way to work on it is actually this now represents a typical track taken by an undergraduate student, where there's obviously stuff in the core here, but an extension out into one or more of these application areas from the very beginning of the curriculum, so that even the freshman courses have connections to a set of interesting application areas. And students can actually pick one of these tracks that they might want to explore while they're still taking the fundamentals in the center. So what this does essentially is expand the domain of opportunity for students from the beginning to explore applications of engineering, or computer science in this case. So if you're going to do that, then of course this has got to shrink, because otherwise there's no opportunity for students to actually explore the application areas. And so that's actually the hard part. I don't know how many of you have ever had discussions with engineering faculty about along the following lines. We really need to provide more opportunity for our students to explore interesting applications. How many of you agree? Everyone agrees, right? We need to do that. Okay, so if we're going to do that, then we really need to find some way to sort of shrink the foundational parts of whatever the major is. How many of you agree? Everybody agrees, right? Now, let's talk about which part of the foundation we're actually going to get rid of. Now, how about if we take the course that you teach, and we're going to actually have to shrink this, because, oh, wait a minute, I mean, this is foundational to an engineering degree, and we can't do that. So that's where the battles actually happen, and at the end of the day, you simply have to agree that we have to do this. And this is going to lead me a little later into a discussion about online education, because I want to make the argument that if we're going to do this and recognize we can't teach our students everything they're going to need to know throughout their careers, then we've got to think about continuing education, professional education, education throughout their careers as a means of basically keeping them up to date not only in these areas but also in the application areas, which are going to change with time. So we made these changes in our CS program, and this is number of majors, and you can see here's the internet bubble around 2000. The crash dropped down by a factor of 2. Here's where we changed the curriculum, and it's now back up to roughly the size. So the students have reacted with their feet by choosing computer science as a major, and in large measure we think it's because the curriculum has been quite radically changed to make it much more interesting from the beginning for students to think about what they could do with a computer science degree. So I use this as an example of what we need to be doing in the vertical part of the T to provide for technical educations. So now I want to turn to this area, or these areas, because these are actually a lot harder to think about. I mean, we sort of know how to do this, and we can fiddle with the curriculum and maybe make it better and so on in a variety of ways. But thinking about how to do this is something a little bit different for engineering schools and engineering educators. And I want to show you a couple of examples of things that I'm going to take examples from Stanford because I know them better, but I want to say from the beginning that many other universities are trying these kinds of approaches. And so there are lots of places, including Davis, I think, that are trying to infuse in the education of their students some things beyond the deep technical skill set that historically we've provided. So I'll take these because I know them well, because they're at Stanford. So one is the D School, which I'll say a bit more about in a minute, but it basically is focused on creativity, innovation, thinking out of the box, team-based design, some of these skill sets that are not so easy to teach. And then the second one is the entrepreneurship program, which is focused really on entrepreneurship, management issues, and business issues. And giving our students some exposure to these kinds of skills we take as a very important part of their education as well. So let me start with a question. So if we accept a goal that we want to provide for our students some skill in being creative, innovative, thinking out of the box and so on. So how do we do that? I mean, how do you teach students to do that? And so as I mentioned a few minutes ago, you don't do it by having someone list the 10 bullet points to becoming a creative person. So what we've learned, and what many others have learned over the years, is that the way you teach creativity is by putting students in situations where they're initially very uncomfortable, situations where they don't know what the answer is, where they have to sort of be creative in order to get out of the box that you put them into. And a lot of this is done through outside the classroom experiences. And I'm going to show you a short video here that illustrates one example of how this kind of thing can be done. Now, the example I'm going to show you is actually a national, actually international competition, student competition that was started 6 or 7 years ago. And the way this works is that the students form teams of 3, 4, 5 students, sometimes a few more, and they don't even know what the competition is. I mean, all they know is that they're going to show up, for example, on a Friday evening. The competition is going to last through the weekend, and on Sunday, someone's going to be declared a winner. Okay? But they don't know what the competition is. So the first strategy here is you better not form a team that has 4 double E's in it. You know, because whatever happens, you know, it's not going to be focused on a narrow discipline. So the way this works is that the competition, the students show up and all they know is they're going to be given a physical object. And they don't know what it is. It could be a paper clip, could be a $5 bill, could be something. And over the course of the weekend, they have to create the most economic value that they can out of that object. So that's the challenge. Now I want to show you a little video which is actually on YouTube, and it's a little hyped and everything else, but I think you'll get the message that this will illustrate the idea.
Imagine the future the way you'd like to see it.
If you can imagine it, then it can be.
Go to the problem and imagine a world where that problem has been removed, and then say, well, how many steps are there from this world to that world?
Imagining a new future, a new path, a new direction.
If you have the power to imagine it, you have the power to change the world.
Imagine a more perfect world than the one we live in, and then to actually engage in making that happen.
I believe I can fly. I believe I can touch the sky. I think about it every night and day. Spread my wings and fly away. I believe I can soar. See me running through that open door. I believe I can.
People think that pressure is bad, but pressure in a very short period of time can be very stimulating.
It taps into the rawest level of their creativity.
It puts down the gauntlet of challenge and inspiration.
Sometimes silence can seem so loud. There are miracles in life unknown.
You never have infinite resources, and you're given this constraint, and in this constraint it's posted past.
We define the value of our project as innovating outside of the box. And the box here is actually posted there.
I believe I can fly. I believe I can touch the sky. I think about it every night and day. Spread my wings and fly away. I believe I can soar. See me running through that open door.
And our grand total came out to over $3,200.
I believe I can fly high. 'Cause I believe in you. If I can.
Entrepreneurship is an extreme sport. You gotta do it.
This is an important way to progress in life.
So the experiment and focus.
I bet you'll be blown away.
I believe I can fly. I believe I can touch the sky. I think about it every night and day. Spread my wings and fly away. I believe I can soar. See me running through that open door. I believe I can fly. 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 Imagine it. Imagine it.
So the important thing here is not so much what the individual teams did with their post-its, but the important thing is that every student who went through that competition walked out of it believing they could be a creative person, that they could take something, a problem that was not well defined in the beginning and turn into something really interesting and unusual. And a lot of students who've done these kinds of things come back and say, you know, that experience that I had was among the most valuable things that I did as a student at whatever university they happen to be at. So these are generally outside the classroom things. A lot of them are competitions, and you just need to find ways to teach students how to be entrepreneurial and how to be creative. The second example I want to show you is the D School, and the concept here is that you know, when engineers go out into industry and start working, they're going to be thrown into a situation where they have to work with different kinds of people. You know, it's funny because when I'm a double E by background. When I did my senior design project, you know, my senior design project was with 4 or 5 other double E's, right? And so we sort of got a little microcontroller board and we designed something. It's just sort of 5 double E's working on a double E project, and that's a senior project, right? I mean, you go to work, that's not what the world's like. You know, you're going to be thrown into a situation which you got to work with business people, you got to work with human factors people, you got to work with people, ethnographers who understand markets and so on. So the idea behind the D-School is to create projects and teams that really take advantage of technology, which is obviously important. Also a business perspective, because if you can't manufacture something for a price that people are willing to pay, no one's going to buy it. And human values things. If you can't design something that people want, then they're not going to buy it. And so creating products and things is all about blending these kinds of tools. And David Kelly, who was the founder of IDEO, is also on our ME faculty, was really the originator of this. So the classrooms at the D-School look like this. They're sort of very different than a traditional engineering classroom. They're very much groups and faculty teaching in a very different kind of a way. In fact, one of the stories I love about the D-School is that they very often have team teaching, you know, where there will be a faculty member from engineering and one from business who will be up there and they'll be talking, for example, about startup companies or some topic. And what often happens is that the two faculty members actually get in disagreements, you know, about things, which is part of the style of the classes. And so they'll actually argue with each other about some particular point. And what always happens in the classroom when that occurs is that before the end of the class, one of the students, at least one, will put his or her hand up and will say, "So who's grading this class?" And they'll want to know. So, but it's a very different kind of environment than you would expect in a typical engineering classroom. So the projects they do, I just want to show you one for lack of time. I'll just say a bit about this one. The problem that was presented to one of these teams, which was an interdisciplinary team of business, engineering, and sociology students who were working together, was the following. You know, in undeveloped parts of the world, there are lots of premature children who are born who die before they can ever get to a hospital because there's no electricity where they live and they live, you know, 20 miles away from the nearest hospital. And an issue that these young infants often have is they can't regulate their body temperature. And so they die because they can't keep themselves warm while they are transported to the hospital. So the challenge was to invent or create or design an incubator which would cost something like a hundredth of the cost of a standard incubator that you see in a hospital. So the first thing the students realized, of course, was that there's no electricity, so we can't plug something in. And so they iterated through this, multiple designs and everything to figure out what to do, and they eventually converged on this little sleeping bag, which is way more sophisticated than it looks because it has inside it a phase change material, which is actually a wax material which has a melting temperature of 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you can actually take this and heat it up in the sun or whatever, and then it maintains a temperature of 98 degrees Fahrenheit for something like 10 hours. And so you simply put the infant in it, and you can carry the infant to the hospital, and it's made a dramatic change. And so in the best tradition, the students formed a company, which is now set up in India, actually, where they're manufacturing these things by the tens of thousands. And the cost is $20, which is 1% of the cost of a typical incubator you would find in a hospital. So it's a very different way of thinking about problems. The last example here is the STV Entrepreneurship Program, and we have a program at Stanford. You have some programs here, I think, and many universities do, that teach courses and seminars and student competitions and internships and so on to try and give students different kinds of experiences than they would get in their technical courses. Now, one thing that's important here is to think about what entrepreneurship really is, and one definition I like a lot, because entrepreneurship is not just starting companies. That's how people think about it. But entrepreneurship is actually, this is a quote from one of our students, it's a mindset, you know, sort of an outlook that says not everything is right, and I think I can make it better. And it's sort of that view of the world that really represents an entrepreneurial way of thinking about problems and thinking about the world. So just as an example, these are courses which are offered in the engineering school at Stanford. Certainly when I was a student, I never would have seen courses that had these kinds of titles, which are electives. They're not part of a major. They're just available to students. But there are some you might expect, you know, how to manage high-tech ventures, but there are also courses on negotiation, the creativity innovation competitions that I showed you the example of earlier. And a whole set of courses here that sort of enable students to get a different perspective outside the deep technical education that they take. So if we're going to make room for these things in the curriculum, then we need to shrink the core of technical things. Otherwise, students only have 24 hours in the day, and they simply can't have the opportunity to take these kinds of courses. So let me just briefly talk about research just for a couple minutes, and then I want to spend a few minutes on online education. So how do we get young people interested in engineering or science or math kinds of careers? Well, the National Academy of Engineering has actually created a website, which if you haven't seen it, it's actually a really good website that talks about the grand challenges for engineering in the 21st century. And they got a bunch of smart people together to say, so if you're an engineer in this century, what are the problems you could work on that might really make a difference in a global scale? And there's a whole set of things here. Some obvious ones, you know, making solar energy economical, managing the nitrogen cycle, clean water, and so on. But there are some probably unexpected ones, like advanced personalized learning, which I think ties in with the online education stuff. And engineering better medicines, which is a huge opportunity in this century. So if you're interested, there's a lot of material on the NAU website about these things. Now, the reason I show this is that a lot of engineering schools are focusing their research, graduate research programs to try and tackle some of these problems. Now, the challenge in doing that is if you think about any of these problems, they are not problems that are easily solved by an individual faculty member deep diving in his or her discipline. So it's highly unlikely that someone who is an expert in solid-state physics, for example, is going to really solve even something like making this happen, because there are all kinds of other issues besides the physics of photovoltaics that impact whether or not photovoltaics can be commercially viable. So the truth is that these are interdisciplinary, and they're not going to be solved by individual faculty, and so we need to figure out a way to incentivize faculty to work together across traditional boundaries and across traditional departments. And a lot of universities have spent a lot of time thinking about how to do this, some more successfully than others. But it's not easy because universities, as we all know, have spent centuries building up this structure called departments, which have big walls and which have a lot of people in them, which are often very inward-looking and not very outward-looking. And so how do you break those walls down? How do you incentivize faculty and students to build the kinds of interdisciplinary teams that are going to make a difference in these large-scale problems? So I'll just show you two quick examples. One is you can change the rules of the game by how you think about facilities to house faculty and students. And this is an example from Stanford. There are many others that are around. This was the first of these that we built. It's called the Clark Center. And it's a building which doesn't house a department. It's a building which houses a collection of faculty who want to work on issues at the intersection between engineering and medicine and biology. And this was a state-of-the-art building that opened 10 years ago. And the rules of the game for this building were, if you're a faculty member in, say, mechanical engineering or biology, and you want to move in here, all these brand spanking new labs, all these great facilities, you have to vacate your lab in your building. You've got to move, lock, stock, and barrel. You know, no two offices, no two labs. So for a while after we built this, we thought it was going to be empty and no one would move in. But after a little time, some of the younger faculty said, you know, this is sort of interesting, and I'll do it. I'll move in there. Well, 10 years later, this is now probably the most popular building on campus for faculty and students to have their research programs in their labs, because they're getting to work with different kinds of people than they would ever work with in their home department. And they're getting to work on problems that are very different than they would work on in the narrow discipline in which they have deep expertise. So building these teams can partly be done through facilities. Part of it can be done through money. You know, money is, research money is a big coin of the realm in universities. And so you can set up research opportunities, seed research funding. And if you're providing the money, you can set the rules. And so you can say, okay, we've got 50K, 100K grants we're putting on the table here, and the rules of the game are if you want to apply for them, it's got to be two faculty who've never worked together. You have to jointly apply for one of these grants, and the proposal you write's got to be interdisciplinary. If you don't want to apply, that's fine. Don't. But people who are interested in building these kinds of connections will do it. This has turned out for us and for others to be have an incredible ROI, return on investment. You know, the 100K or a few 100K in seed money allows these faculty to work together in new ways, start a new program, and then apply for large programs to federal funding agencies, which they would never have been able to apply for individually. And so the ROI has been huge. And finally, we can put faculty billets into areas that fill the gaps in between the traditional departments. So the coin of the realm is billets, space, and dollars, and you can use those things to really incentivize faculty to work in different areas. And I was going to talk about some research projects, but I think I'll skip that for lack of time. If there's questions at the end, I'll come back, because I want to say a few words about online education. So we've been involved for more than 40 years, initially with TV broadcasting to Silicon Valley, to mostly people in companies of regular courses and so on. And we have done things with K-12 education. There's lots of Stanford stuff on iTunes U and so on, as there is from other universities. But what has changed in recent years is a recognition that there may be a goal for this, which is a lot broader and a lot more significant than we've thought about in the past. And that really wraps around this idea that engineers especially can't walk out of their universities with everything they're going to need to know for the next 40 years. They just can't, because we don't even know what they're going to need to know in 20 years. So we need to think about lifelong education, and this is actually an interesting quote where it says that, you know, the ability to learn faster than your competitors, in fact, may be the biggest competitive advantage that any company has in the long term. So the issues here are, how do you think about online degrees? What's the business model? What kinds of education courses should we set up? So I want to show you one example, which is one of these courses that you mentioned in the introduction. Jennifer Woodham is the chair of our computer science department, and she teaches a course in Introduction to Databases, CS 145, which typically has 140 Stanford students in this class. It's on-campus lectures, the whole thing. So she decided about a year ago that she was going to put this up on the internet free. All the courses were going to be, the lectures were recorded and everything else, and just put it up free and see what happens. So what happened, it was actually put up last fall. So she had 60,000 enrolled students to start with. 26,000 of them submitted at least one homework assignment, and actually about 10%, a little more, completed the entire course, including exams and homework assignments and everything else, and got a certificate of completion from Jennifer, not from Stanford, that they had actually completed the course. So the course is still online, and the numbers have actually continued to go up, and you can see these are just amazing numbers in terms of the numbers of students worldwide who've taken this particular course. And since then, about a dozen other ones have been put up with the same format, completely free, and the numbers have been quite similar in all of them. Tens or hundreds of thousands of students who are taking these courses. Now, it's important to realize that these are not set up, most of them anyway, are not set up in the traditional way a course is taught. So this is kind of a flow diagram for one of the courses. This is a different course, CS 228. But the courses are set up so that each of these little bubbles here corresponds to a 5 or 10 minute video chunk. So students who are working their way through this can kind of find their way through this flow with branches. So if they watch a 5 or 10 minute video chunk and they're confused or don't get it, then they can either rerun it and look at it again, or they can take a branch, and the branch may show them a different explanation of the same concept or so on. There also are built-in hard stops where they have to take quizzes, which are all computer graded before they can go on, to make sure that they understand the concepts. So these are set up in a very different way. And this is the video quality and so on is pretty simple. I mean, it's just a web camera and a little talking head, and then notepad kinds of things that show the PowerPoint slides and so on that are being used by the instructor down here. So technology is very simple, which is part of the reason why it's exploding so rapidly. And Jennifer, when she set this up, this is an example of one of these hard stops. So this is kind of the timeline down here, and these little marks are the hard stops where you got to take a quiz before you can go on and watch the next chunks in the course. And they're all computer graded, and there are explanations, for if you get the wrong answer, you can do it again until you get the right answer. And so the goal is to get people to understand the concepts. One of the more interesting things that happened was making use of all the social networking tools that are developing now. So chat rooms and things like that were set up. And it turned out that a lot of the questions that were generated by these 100,000 students were actually answered by other students. And there was a hierarchical system where when a question was asked by a student, then the community, these 100,000 students, got to vote on whether this was a good question or not. And questions which everyone thought were good questions bubbled up to the top. And if they didn't get answered by one of the other students, then eventually Jennifer would answer the top few that got to the top of the bubble. So it worked actually incredibly well. In fact, there was one of the students in the class who Jennifer didn't know. Turned out she was a woman who lives in San Diego. Turned out to be an expert. She'd never taken a database class, but she ended up answering something like 900 questions. She didn't discriminate against dumb questions and answered the good questions and the bad questions. And Jennifer watched all this happening over the social networks and was amazed at how good her answers were. So at the end of the class, Jennifer actually invited her to come up to Stanford to meet her and buy her lunch. I think she was trying to convince her to come to grad school. But it turned out that she was working, she's in her late 20s or early 30s, works in a family company and had no interest in going to grad school and just took this class because she wanted to take it. She also got 2 marriage proposals from other students in the class. So anyway, so she was apparently really good. Anyway, there are things like Jennifer set up these fireside chats, which were done once a week or more, and you can see she even had a little fire in the background to represent the. And then when Thanksgiving came along, she had a little turkey in the background, and at Christmas, she had a winter scene in the background. And these were just online discussions with students who were wanting to chat with her about the topic, questions, and so on in the class. So it's a very different kind of experience. And if we surveyed the students in this class afterwards, and this is what's one of the interesting things is most of them are professionals in the software industry. Most of them are taking the class because they wanted to learn about databases because they needed it in their job or because they wanted to get into a different job which required this kind of background. So you can see there were some college students and so on, even some K-12 students down here. But the center of gravity is in professional education, at least for these kinds of courses. And you can see the reasons that they took it. I want to sharpen my job skills, better job, I'm curious, and so on. And even a few down here where there wasn't a course available at some other university, so they took this online course. So I want to just, besides opening this up to the world and providing online education free, there is a huge impact on on-campus students. And this is happening through what many people call the flipped classroom idea. So the Stanford students who were taking these classes, actually the same class, the database class, actually watched the videos just as the online students did, but they also came to class. So they still had 3 classes a week, and they came to class, but the classes weren't lectures. The classes were interactive problem solving, guest lectures, research presentations, advanced topics, help review sessions. So it was a very different use of the classroom time, and arguably a much better use of the classroom time than a faculty member standing up there with his or her back to the class writing equations on the blackboard. So I think actually that for on-campus students, that this is going to have a very profound impact on how we teach a lot of the material that we currently use and do in fairly traditional ways in classrooms. So just a couple more slides and I'm done. Many people think we're at an inflection point with respect to all of this, and the 2 reasons are that there are now quite good automated assessment and feedback techniques. It's not just a matter of a computer-generated quiz showing up, but this quiz can actually be changed for each student from a large portfolio of questions, and so the students won't get the same questions twice if they redo an exam. And the crowdsourcing things, the social media and so on, this example of this woman, are, I think, a huge part of why this is different than it was a few years ago. And so this is all enabled by all the social networking things that are developing very rapidly. Now the big question is, what's the business model? Because right now, these are being given away free. And any of you who have had any experience with business know that this is not a long-term sustainable business model. So there are a lot of people who are exploring how to monetize this and what should or shouldn't be done and who ought to own it, whether universities ought to do it or whether for-profit companies ought to do it. And we're dabbling in all of those, as are many other universities. But it's, this is a huge question, you know, how to make this a sustainable long-term thing. So what I've tried to talk about today then is the technical education, thinking out of the box, research, just said a little bit about it, and then this idea that if we have to recognize we can't do everything in 4 years, then we need to think about how to do it through the lifetime or through the career of our students. So I think the world's changing, universities are changing, and education is changing, and I think when I look at all this, it seems to me we live in really very interesting times. And the last slide here, I like this quote a lot from Chuck Vest, who was the former president of MIT and is currently the president of the National Academy of Engineering. And what he says, you know, students are driven by passion, curiosity, engagement, and dreams. And in the long run, making universities and engineering schools exciting, creative, rigorous, demanding, and empowering milieus is more important than specifying curricular details. It's more important. And I think that's exactly right. So when I'm more of a visual person, and when I think about what that means in terms of how we should educate our students, I think about turning the 1950s classroom into something that looks a little bit more like this for our engineering students. So we don't actually have a class in this at Stanford, but we're thinking about it. So thank you for your attention.
We've had a recent here, so that was a great comment. Thank you. Fascinating. Subhash. And then Ray.
The question I have is, I may be couching in different terms what you said, that we need to create critical thinkers who can think on their own, they can solve problems, and we don't constrain their thinking. And then they're inquisitive, and they will learn on their own. I taught a class last quarter. I did not cover some of the topics in the class, but they were tested. Take home exam. Luckily, you can go to the web and answer, find the solution, answer the questions. What has happened is we are constraining our students. You said the same thing. I'm using a different term. But our high schools are not helping us.
Well, there are examples actually of these kinds of things moving down into high schools. Many of you may have looked at the Khan Academy, for example. You know, in the lectures, they're actually short little chunks that deal with math and science and many other topics. There are some high schools in the Bay Area that have used that to create this flipped classroom technique, where the students are expected to watch the Khan Academy explanation of technical topics at home on the internet, and they come to school the next day and the teacher actually works on problem solving and extensions and things like that. And it's,
it has to happen more often and on a large scale.
Right.
If we have to compete with the rest of the world
right.
in producing high quality engineers and scientists.
Right. I completely agree. If we don't do this, one might worry a lot, you know, about the future economic.
In India, as you said, or China.
Rick and then Dick.
Jim, engineering loses out on about half the population to begin with, women. What are your thoughts on making engineering more attractive?
So, Rick, I actually, in our field, in EE, that's a true statement. It's not a true statement in other areas of engineering. I mean, if I look at the undergraduate engineering majors at Stanford, for example, we have almost 50% women in areas like environmental engineering, in bioengineering, in areas like product design and so on. And if you ask what are the common characteristics of those engineering disciplines, they tend to be disciplines that are working on big problems, you know, global scale problems, and they tend to be engineering disciplines where teamwork is really important. And I don't know why women tend to be attracted preferentially to those domains rather than EE or computer science or some areas of ME. But it seems like the areas in engineering schools that are sort of hardcore physics-based, you know, have much greater difficulty, and where there's a perception that the problems that the discipline works on are not the sort of big global scale problems, but much more focused, individualized kinds of things. That's where women don't go, and I think actually they may just be smarter than men are. But anyway.
That's why they stay away from it.
Right. right.
Yes, so just a comment into at least to the question. Essentially, the new business model, which we don't know what it is going to replace textbooks, the teacher in the classroom, or perhaps the college. So in a sense, it could disintegrate the university. In other words, the education would be there, but there would be no locus.
Right.
So how do you create the locus so that Stanford still is Stanford, at the same time educating around the world? I mean, suppose people signing up from everywhere. So do you have a model for where you go next?
Well, I mean, we have thoughts, but it's a really important question, you know, because if you take an extreme case, then everybody learns online, there aren't any physical universities and so on, you know, in another 25 or 50 years. I actually don't think that will happen because actually it may happen at the professional education level, sort of the master's level. I don't think it's likely to happen at the undergraduate level, and it clearly can't happen at the PhD level, you know, because the PhD level is a one-on-one relationship between a student and a faculty member. At the undergraduate level, so much of the value of a residential education in particular comes from being surrounded by other really smart young people and learning from them as much as you learn inside the classroom. So much of it comes from, especially if we use some of these competition kinds of things out of the classroom activities, so much of it comes, I mean, it's hard to do that online, you know, and so I think it will force universities to reinvent themselves because if we offer a program which is basically you or I or somebody else standing up at a blackboard writing equations, the students will do it online, you know, and so we have to figure out what the value of a residential education is and focus on offering that. And if we do that, I think we can offer things which are very different and in many ways far better than what is achievable online, at least in the foreseeable future. But we can't stick our heads in the sand. You know, those universities who put their heads in their sand are going to lose big time, I think.
That's a great presentation, thank you. The question I have is how you emphasize teamwork, or how you solve the problem of teamwork if you move many of the coursework you offer into computer-based, because that tends to isolate people, not bringing them together. And the same way that telephone didn't replace conferences, we still go on person to conferences around the world, talk to people face to face. How that's going to, do you have any ideas how that's going to affect the online education?
Well, I think there are some things which are just not going to be done online very easily in the foreseeable future. And, you know, project-based learning and those kinds of things are very hard to replicate, at least as far as I can see into the future. But I think it's going to cause us as educators to think a lot about how we teach, about how we grade students, you know, because right now it's very easy to have a traditional classroom and give an exam that everybody takes and we grade it and we stack, you know, get the A's, B's, and C's out of that and so on. If a lot of the stuff is done online and the goal is not to weed people out or separate them into grade buckets, but rather to make sure that everybody finds a personalized path through it so that they master the material at the end, then, you know, how one thinks about grading that is a little bit different. And also how one thinks about grading project-based learning courses is a little bit different than the traditional classroom. But, I mean, these are not unsolvable problems, I think. And the question is, what's the best way to educate our students so that they walk out of our institutions and prepared in the very best way possible to have fulfilling lives and to be wildly successful in their careers? So I actually like what's happening because it's causing higher education to ask itself a lot of questions, and we should. You know, we haven't changed in centuries, and we need to change, I think.
One last question out there.
Our college now celebrating the 50th year, and I've been there for 46 of the 50 years. There's no internet, of course. But I remember exactly what she was saying and how much it was needed. Aerojet was making Titan rocket outside Sacramento, and there was 26,000 people working there, many of them engineers. Many of them were structural engineers, computer mechanicists, mechanical engineers, of course. robotics and so forth. And they ended up having a need to really get a little bit a gut feeling about engineering materials and how it fails and high temperature, rockets, rocket motors, exhausts, no carbon, what kind of material design a cone there. So a few of them, myself, more or less, leading it, went over to Aerojet about 1 hour ride, 47 traffic lights, there was no fuel, 150. It worked because there was mechanical engineer structure in the unit. We wanted to know how started testing with them, no feel about materials in terms of granularity, trends, defects, and whatever. It was very rewarding. Internet still hasn't come, but at least the television line, which Stanford has gone, Silicon Valley, came to do this. We had a two-way live audio-video link to the engineers do PhD program in it was almost, yes, the primary is International Lab, honestly, on lab in here. And it was a very interesting experience. You get a mature student body. They really want to learn this stuff. They want to do it quickly because they want to get back to work. There are mortgage to pay. And you had access, if you're the PhD supervisor, to facilities we can never get here, like a proton bombardment unit around Fillmore, radium target, whatever else, extreme height, in my case, material science, strain rate definition, and it just was a wonderful two-way benefits. Now that the internet has come, what you showed us.
Right. Changes everything.
Changes everything.
Right.
It's the real change that is coming, and if we don't get up to it, we will get.
Well, we should look upon this as an opportunity.
Yeah,
you know, we've had these boring lives, right? And now everything's changed, and we better be moving forward. And Hennessy at Stanford is fond of saying, you know, there's a tsunami coming, and we want to be riding it, not building a seawall, you know, to try and stop it.
This is true, and we have to change. The culture of the university has to change. Right. For example, you put in the biology block and mechanical engineering block together in the new building. The question is, they are happy, they are interacting, they are really creating, and the departmental faculty working in American Nucleus package has to recognize this. I have seen difficulties here serving in the central campus place in faculty promotion and rewards when you are split apart.
Right.
It's a reality.
Yes.
And this has to be handled.
Right.
Yeah.
So
our culture has to change.
I agree.
Please join me, Jim. Small token of your lecture and helping us celebrate our 50th. Really enjoyed having you. Really,
it's my
pleasure.
pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you. That's great. That's very nice. Thank you.
We have a box for it, so
okay,
you can
great.
carry it.